Hello everyone, this is the video that goes along with the Chapter 2 PowerPoint. I'm going to just go through it very quickly. Some of the things that I point out in class that are not included or written on the PowerPoint. Pretty much the first part of Chapter 2 just goes through the reasons behind European exploration, and the two of those, the trade deficit and the Christianity. First and foremost, the Europeans were trying to find the quickest way that they could to get to the trade markets that were already existed in China, Southeast Asia, India, and other places around the Indian Ocean. And they were trying to do it quicker because before the age of exploration, what they did was they would trade through the Mediterranean Sea, and it was mostly run by Muslim middlemen, intermediaries that would buy the goods and come and sell them to the Europeans. The problem with that was that the price was always higher, and also this trade market was spreading Islam throughout the world, and Christian Europeans were not very happy about that. So they took it upon themselves that, one, they would get goods cheaper if they did it themselves, and also they could start to spread Christianity if they were the ones who were traveling around the world instead. So those were the two reasons that exploration, discovery, and colonization started to happen. And you've heard of some of these explorers before, so I'm not going to go to too many of them except for Christopher Columbus, because Christopher Columbus is one of the most famous, and we always had said that he discovered America, but you can't discover something when people already live there. And once again, he never knew that he was somewhere new, so you can't really say that he discovered anything because he thought he was in the East Indies. That's why he called the people there Indians, and that name stuck. And Native Americans today are still called Indians, although they are not. Christopher Columbus himself was he kind of went to multiple kingdoms begging for backing for his expedition. And it was Ferdinand and Isabella. They were celebrating the fact that they had pushed the Muslims out of Spain. So they were also trying to kind of go into competition between them and Portugal. So they finally backed his expedition. But Christopher Columbus had some very strange ideas. He thought that, unlike everyone else who decided from going from Europe, that if you go right, you have to go around the tip of Africa to get to those markets of Southeast Asia and China and India and those places. He had the bright idea that instead, if you go left from Europe, that instead you would just make it to the other side of the world and you would get to China pretty quickly. There were two big mistakes with his theory. One, that he thought the world was half the size that it actually is. So he thought it would take like 2 to 3 weeks. Ended up taking a couple of months, and by then, he nearly starved to death his crew. There was a mutiny that was put down, but still, it was not going very well for his expedition. And the other thing was that he had no idea that there was that whole North and South America that existed between Europe and Asia. So there was that hole. But he did finally get there and was able to explore, and because of that, we kind of say he starts off the age of exploration, so that's his place in history. Not always as prominent as it used to be. We don't say that he discovered America anymore, but we do still have Columbus Day, so there's a holiday for him. Other Europeans had been to the Americas. If you take world history, you just study the Vikings. They had gone to Newfoundland and Maine, what would be Maine today, around the year 1000. So there were other Europeans that came to the Americas before him. And there's even evidence that there was a Chinese expedition that possibly made it to the coast of California in the 14th century. But we don't go too much into that because it's outside of our time span for this class. But there's that. One other explorer. America is finally named after Amerigo Vespucci because he's the one that finally figures out that these landmasses are somewhere that Europeans, what he thought Europeans hadn't been before. So he was finally the one that said, hey, this is somewhere new. So that's why it's called America, after Amerigo Vespucci. The line of demarcation, that's important because Spain and Portugal were the first two European nations that really get this age of exploration going. They're both Catholic nations, so the Pope is trying to make sure that these two nations don't really cause trouble with each other. So he draws that, this is Pope Alexander VI, he draws that line of demarcation in 1493, saying everything to the right of that line belongs to Portugal and everything to the left belongs to Spain. He had to redraw that line in 1494 because Portugal wanted Brazil in South America, so they ended up with that. Now Spain gets the better end of the deal because most of the gold and silver is found in Central and South America, so Spain gets a lot of the riches from that. And the other European nations kind of take their time getting involved. It's Portugal that really starts the thing off. Spain quickly overtakes them as number one. And then it's the Netherlands, also known as the Dutch. And then France comes in, and English are actually the very last to get involved. But they're the ones that have the biggest impact. And we call them the English, Great Britain, same thing. They have the longest lasting impact on the rest of the world, not just the Americas. But yeah, they're the last to get involved. But they quickly, within 100 years, are the number one nation of colonization and exploration. And then France is behind them. The Netherlands is kind of pushed off the board, but sort of. They're kind of vying with Spain for third and fourth place. But Portugal is no longer part of it. Most of the other European nations had taken over what Portugal owned. So 100 years after, at least a little bit over 100 years afterwards, Portugal is not even on the map anymore really for exploration. And they're the ones that got it started. But anyway, the Spanish do go to the Americas. Most of the European nations came to the Americas because they wanted to extract the important stuff, gold, silver, any other things I could find, and go back home. Some of them did start to create permanent settlements like the Spanish. Didn't do so well. The goal was that they would go and they would use the natives, as their slave labor, basically, in exchange for converting them forcibly, usually, to Christianity in the form of Catholicism. However, when a person converts to Catholicism, they're supposed to be granted the full rights and protections of being a Catholic. So you couldn't use them as slaves anymore, supposedly, but that meant that the Spanish were not so enthusiastic about converting them, instead just using them as labor. This changes is in the 1550s when Bartholomew de las Casas, he comes over and he writes a book, a short account of the destruction of the Indies. And in this book, he really tears down the Spanish for how they've treated the native population. And what has happened is that because of the introduction of diseases, especially smallpox, most of the native populations have disappeared. Some places up to 95%. The Caribbean islands in particular were pretty much wiped out of population due to the diseases, and it only took around 50 years for that to happen, because they had no immunities. They'd never been exposed to those diseases, so they were pretty much wiped out. So because of De las Casas, the Spanish government did try to crack down a little bit on the harsh treatment of the natives. But then he brings up the idea we can just use African slavery, as our labor source instead. Going forward, Hernan Cortez is the one who kind of took down the Aztecs, and you can read over how that happened. And of course, it was with the help of diseases. One thing about the native population is that everyone was involved in helping the sick. And that was from the youngest to the oldest. But what that meant was that everyone was together around the infected. So it just led to the faster spread of diseases. So faster way to wipe out the population. With the Inca, Francisco Pizarro is the one who kind of puts down the Inca. If you remember from chapter 1, they, whenever their ruler died, the male kin would go to war with each other to find out who would be the next ruler. And that's what was happening when Pizarro comes over. So they're in the middle of one of those wars because the last leader had died due to the smallpox outbreak. So when the new leader comes back to Cusco, the capital city, Pizarro's already taken over it and is able to quickly put them down without as much resistance. A lot of things come out of the Spanish conquest, changes to the world. Price revolution causes kind of a disparity between prices because a lot of the precious metals were controlled by the Spanish, especially silver, because China really wanted silver. So even though they were getting it, it was going straight to China, which was causing a lot of price fluctuation in Europe. And sometimes these other goods that were coming out of it caused price fluctuations that led to a price revolution. Now, biological change, the Columbian exchange, that's once again Columbus is involved. We call that exchange of agricultural products, animals, diseases, and people that eventually spread around the world because of this exploration. And sometimes it's also referred to as triangular trade or circular trade. You probably heard those phrases as well. Racial changes because of the Spanish mixing with the natives and African slaves, and also the natives mixing with African slaves. You get new races that had not existed before this time. The conversion of Christianity usually forcibly changed religion, especially in the Americas, although most of the natives would adopt Christianity but change it to align more with their beliefs. So the Catholicism that exists in Central and South America is not the same as the Catholicism that would exist in Rome of today. And then the last thing, geopolitical, what happens after the Spanish go through their exploration and all these other nations want to get involved? You get the rise of what we know as nations, where they start to solidify their own borders so that they can define what belongs to them outside of their borders. Of all of them, the French are the most welcoming to adopt Native American lifestyle. They adopted the language, the religion sometimes, the dress. They were very much wanting the help of the Native Americans to go into these forested areas to get animals that they wanted for fur trading, usually beavers, but others as well. So they were very willing to adopt the lifestyle of the Native Americans. Some men married, it was mostly French men that went to the Americas. They married into Native women tribes, and they understood that their children belonged to the wife's tribe because the tribes were matrilineal. So sometimes when the Frenchmen went back home, they left their children there with the mothers. And those children later become the intermediaries who would translate for Europeans who come after and the natives. Now, when the English finally do get involved, they don't do very well to begin with. The first one is kind of one of the most famous. It's the lost colony of Roanoke or Roanoke. Either pronunciation is fine. It's just a mystery about what happened to these people. Sir Walter Raleigh is the one in charge of creating this colony. He brings over about 100 people. But the problem is they don't bring enough supplies with them. And these people really have no idea what they're doing when they're trying to create a colony. So he and some others go back to England to get more supplies to come back. And one person who goes with them is John White. Why he's important is because his daughter, Eleanor Dare, gives birth to the very first English person born on American soil, and her name was Virginia Dare. But John White and Sir Walter Raleigh, they go back to England to get supplies. But while they're there, war breaks out between England and Spain. And why that was important is because then the monarchy confiscates all ships and uses them for the war effort. So the ships could not be used for taking supplies elsewhere to any colonies, not just the ones in the Americas. So that goes on for 3 years, and then after 3 years, John White and some others go back to the Americas, and they realize that no one's there at Roanoke, and they don't know what happened to them. There's the word Croatoan kind of carved into a piece of wood, and Croatoan had many different meanings at the time. Some of the natives were kind of called Croatoan. There was an island that was referred to as Croatoan. So at first they searched the nearby island to see if the people were there, and they were not. They tried to look for the tribe that was known as Croatoan, but they couldn't find them. Now, in 1937, a person was hiking through the woods, and they found a stone. A stone that supposedly was written by Eleanor Dare to her father, describing what happened to the colony. And in this little letter on the stone, it said that they were attacked by natives. Most of the people were killed. They had to move on, and some of them were adopted into another native tribe, and so on and so forth. So when that stone was first introduced, the local history department thought it was a hoax, so they kind of threw that stone in a closet somewhere and just left it in the background. Other stones were found throughout the years, but in 2012, these stones were kind of taken out again and started to be looked at a little more closely, and they're trying to date them to see if they could have been written at the time, and if these were letters from Eleanor Dare to her father describing what happened to the colony. And that link that's located on that slide 23, that's that information, and you can see that. What comes out of that whole thing, though, is the joint stock companies, that they got the bright idea that now you can't have just one person or a small group backing these expeditions, because if something goes bad, like a war breaks out, you need someone else who can send ships and money and supplies to keep the colony going. So joint stock companies were created, and this is where anyone who has any extra money can invest in the company, because they expect to get a return on their investment if some kind of valuable stuff is found in the new colony. Now, a little bit later, 1607, Jamestown. Jamestown becomes the first truly permanent English settlement in the Americas. It's Jamestown is the town, and then Virginia becomes the colony itself, the name. Where did these names come from? Well, Jamestown is named after King James I, who takes over after Queen Elizabeth I dies. So where does Virginia come from? Well, Queen Elizabeth I was called the Virgin Queen. Was she a virgin? No, most likely not. But she did not want to get married because if she got married, she would have to give up her power, and her husband would be the one who would be king and control everything. So she instead says that she will just remain the Virgin Queen so that she can give all of her time and energy to her people instead of a husband and children. So that's why she was called the Virgin Queen, and that's where the name Virginia comes from. Jamestown is more successful because they do have more people coming in. However, the first couple of years are pretty rough. Nearly half the colony dies because they were not prepared for the winter. One reason for that is creating this colony. It's like the show Naked and Afraid. You're kind of thrown out in the wilderness and you're supposed to survive. And especially these colonists that come to Jamestown are just regular, everyday people who do not have the skills necessary to create a colony. So half of them die, and only the help of the natives really keep the colony going until the next shipment of the English come in and more supplies and so on and so forth. But because of that, they are able to finally, a couple of years later, get to around 900 settlers and grow more and more after that. But Jamestown is also very famous because of the people involved. John Smith, Pocahontas, and later John Rolfe. John Smith was a real person, and he was one of the leaders of that colony to create Jamestown. But he was a very interesting person. If you've seen the cartoon movie, you should. It's a good movie. Not quite accurate, but still a good movie. He was a very braggadocious person, and a lot of the information that we have about the initial Jamestown and Pocahontas come from John Smith, but in almost all of his writings, he kind of over-exaggerates things to really talk himself up. So you got to take what he says with a grain of salt. Pocahontas herself she doesn't get enough credit for really what she did. She was the intermediary between the natives and the settlers at Jamestown. Pocahontas was not her real name. Her name was Matoaka. She was born Amunate and then later changed to Matoaka when she goes through the adult ceremony, the ceremony where young women become adults. So her name is Matoaka. But they called her Pocahontas, which means little playful one. And so that's what she was known as, that nickname of Pocahontas. So she helps John Smith with interactions with the natives, and kind of helps that initial settlement of colonists coming in. Her father, of course, Powhatan, was very willing to be friends with the English at first. Now when Powhatan dies, the successor is not so willing to be friends with the English, and in fact goes on like a killing spree and kills nearly half of the colony. But anyway, with Pocahontas, later, after John Smith pretty much alienates everyone in the colony and he is shipped back to England before he's killed, John Rolfe comes over from England, and he is famous for two things. One is because although tobacco already existed, he creates it as the first cash crop, a crop that can be grown just to sell at market. And even though King James I, didn't like tobacco, he saw how profitable it was. So he kind of backed some of those ventures. So John Rolfe could create that cash crop. And tobacco was so popular, and especially in Jamestown and the rest of Virginia colony, it becomes a form of currency. They use it as a type of money. Then John Rolfe also later goes on to marry Pocahontas. Now Pocahontas, relations between the natives and the English really go downhill after John Smith leaves. She's kidnapped. She's taken hostage by the English settlers because she is the daughter of Powhatan, but she's not his only daughter. like unlike the movie that it shows. So they feel like they will get quite a bit of ransom by holding her. So they want some valuable items, but they also want the return of some of the settlers who had been taken hostage. Powhatan only gives half of the ransom, though, so the English keep Pocahontas for a few years. She's kept hostage. Now, there are varying ideas about how she's treated while she's a hostage. Some say she was treated very harshly. She was raped and beaten. Other historians say no, she was treated very well because she learns English and eventually converts to Christianity. And when she converts, she has to take the name Rebecca. Because in order to fully convert, you have to give up all of your native ways, and that is the language, the dress, and the names and everything. So she adopts English style of dress and takes the name Rebecca. And with John Rolfe, he even had to ask permission from the governor of the colony to marry her. And in his letter, there is a letter that he writes, and he is basically saying that he will be saving her soul if he marries her, because she will fully then be a Christian because she will be married to a Christian man, so on and so forth. But that's the story Pocahontas that really doesn't get enough, and there's more to it than that. That's just a very short rundown. We just don't give enough credit to how well she helped the relations between the natives and the English settlers, because she's eventually asked to go back to England and meet the king and queen, and she does, and that is supposed to help the relations as well. But she gets sick while she's there, either pneumonia or tuberculosis, and she dies, and she's buried in England. So because of that, the relations between the natives and the English settlers go downhill from there after that. She did have a son too. His name was Thomas, and he later goes on to take over the tobacco plantation after his father dies. Once again, there's more to that story, but that's what I'm going to give you for now. But after that, the relations between the English go downhill. The fighting really starts and takes off. Different colonies start to pop up too, and the changes in who controls it. Jamestown in particular was controlled initially by the Virginia Company. They're not doing so well, so then King James I seizes it as a royal colony. He puts his own governor in place, and who's supposed to control it. But the people are used to self-rule, so they have their own House of Burgesses, the first a real form of self-government in the colonies. Maryland's created as a proprietary colony. Once again, the proprietor is supposed to be able to control it however he wants to, but the people don't have that. They create the first Toleration Act of 1649 for peace between them. And it basically says that you grant freedom of worship as long as you accept the divinity of Jesus Christ, because this colony is particularly made up of both Catholic and Protestant, so they had to come up with some way to get along. You also get the introduction of Puritans and Separatists. The Puritans felt like the Church of England could be purified if you just change it up a bit. The Separatists thought that it was irredeemable, so they just need to completely separate from the Church of England and form their own churches and things. But both groups come to the New World, that's what the Americas were called, to create their own colonies and try to make these perfect societies that fit with their own ideologies. Doesn't always work out, but that's what their goal was. Like for Massachusetts, the Mayflower, if you've had U.S. history before, you've heard of the Mayflower, that first ship that had the Pilgrims on it, comes to the New World. They're actually supposed to go to Virginia. They're off course, though, and they land at land where modern-day Massachusetts. Because they don't really have a charter for this location, though, they form the Mayflower Compact. that says that if anyone else shows up with a charter, they will fight them to keep that land. They don't have to fight anyone, though, because they eventually do get that charter from the monarchy in 1621. So there's no fighting, but it's still an interesting thing that they created, that they were going to fight to keep that land because they felt that God directed them there, so it belonged to them. And also with that Plymouth and that first initial colony in Massachusetts, we get the first type of Thanksgiving. It was a harvest festival in 1621. There were actually several, though, throughout the colonies between the natives and the settlers that came together, and they would eat together. So that creates, we kind of adopt that and created a holiday known as Thanksgiving out of it. But it was not just one event, it was multiple events that happened. Massachusetts is so interesting, and it takes so many different changes over time. The Massachusetts Bay Company, they create a charter, and they send John Winthrop over with about 1,000 Puritans, and he really wanted to create one of those utopian societies. He called it a city upon a hill, in which the whole world could look at and try to emulate, to try to be like his city, his perfect society. That was the goal anyway. It didn't work out so well for them. They were very strict. They had an interesting idea of what they considered freedom, was that you followed these strict rules set forth by the church. You did not have the ability to step one toe out of line. And if you did all that, then the freedom is that your soul would eventually be free because you followed all these dictates. But even very quickly with that initial colony being set up, you had people who kind of go against that. And even one of them was even the minister of their church. His name was Roger Williams in Salem, Massachusetts. His idea, though, was that because in the initial Massachusetts colony, the church controlled everything, politics, city government, everything. Roger Williams thought that church and state should be separate, that church leaders should control what happens in church, and city leaders should control what happens in the city. You should not combine your church life with your outside church life. So that caused him to get in trouble, and he was banished from the colony and had to go on and form his own colony. And it becomes later Rhode Island. The location he finds is Providence, because once again he thought God led him there, so Providence. Another one who is very famous, Anne Hutchinson. She was such a great, interesting character. She was ahead of her time so much because she had such strange and forceful ideas about religion. And she started to have Bible study in her home. And the problem with that was that she included men in her Bible study. And according to Puritan theology and life, a woman was not a leader of a man. Men should lead over women in all aspects of life, not just in the church, but at home and everywhere. So a woman having some leadership position over a man was just unheard of. So it was a no-no. And of course, another belief she held was that you don't necessarily have to rely completely on the Bible for your information about God. She thought that God is continually sending messages to people, and that they should listen to those messages that they have within them and not necessarily completely on the Bible. So that was, once again, against everything the Puritans stood for. Her ideas were called antinomianism, and she is in big trouble for that. So she's been on trial and is found guilty of sedition and contempt. But she's very haughty in her trial. And there's an entire transcript of the trial. And it's always great reading through it. And a lot of the depictions, you'll see her nose is kind of up in the air, and she's shown as that being very haughty. And she uses the Bible against her accusers and has memorized the Bible very well. And sometimes, even like when John Winthrop is questioning her, he has to go back and kind of review those Bible passages, although she had them from memory. But yeah, so she's kicked out of Massachusetts, and she goes to Rhode Island as well and forms her own colony. Unfortunately, she does have a tragic end. A few years later, after moving to Rhode Island, natives attack their village, and she and her family are killed. But she does create a colony that is more accepting of people who do not want to live in those strict lifestyle of the Puritans of Massachusetts. So more people start to go to Rhode Island. And another thing about her is that if she had lived 50 years in Massachusetts, 50 years ahead in Massachusetts, she would have been part of those Salem witchcraft trials that we'll talk about in chapter 3. So it's just great that, she lived when she did and was not put on trial as a witch, because she would have been. And if you'll see on slide 42 what that picture is, I didn't really have a caption, but I went to Boston last year, and in the north, because everybody lives so close together and they don't have that much land, they follow the conservation of history instead of the preservation of history. So they try to keep these historical buildings and things, but use them as something else. In the South, because we have so much land and so much space and whatever, we use the preservation of history, where we keep historical buildings as pristine and as much like it was as we can. So why is that important? On slide 42, if you'll look, that interesting shaped part of that building was Anne Hutchinson's house. And today, where all those Bible studies were held, and today it's a Chipotle. So, and when we start talking about like Ben Franklin and Samuel Adams and all them, one of their meeting houses is today a steakhouse. So there's that. But going forward with the natives and the English settler, because more and more keep coming in and more colonies are created, they are starting to have more and more conflicts. One of them is the Pequot War. A lot of wars break out, but what starts to happen is that the English start to take on this mentality that it's okay to completely wipe out the natives if they need to, because according to them, God has provided them with this land and it is theirs. And now they just have to get rid of these savages and use it however they want to. So that's the idea that they take. And we'll talk a lot about Christianity in this class, because it was the major motivating factor of a lot of this exploration and later colonization, and a lot of events that happened was in the name of Christianity and things like that. But that's pretty much chapter 2. As always, if you have any questions, just let me know. See you soon.